What's that sound? It's for amusement only, the EM and Bingo Pinball Podcast. Welcome back to For Amusement Only. This is Nick Baldridge. Today, I've been working on multi-races. I am, in fact, just about finished with the first game in multi-races, and that is 1950's Turf King. I picked Turf King for a few different reasons. The first being that it's a relatively complicated game. It's in fact one of the most complicated one-balls, being one of the last few that were produced. And the second reason I picked that, well, I guess to elaborate on that. So it's complicated, okay, but it's very similar to some of the early bingos as far as the complexity goes and the portioning and so forth. Not exactly the same, and I'll get into that in a minute, but it is similar. However, the second reason is because I have an actual copy of Turf King, and multi-races is right across the aisle from it, so I can just turn my body 180 degrees, and all of a sudden, I'm playing Turf King, the real deal. So I can make sure that my portioning and so forth is correct. I'm also able to document the various discs inside for use in developing the coin flash animations, as well as some of the portioning, which is not exactly clear in all cases. So let's talk about portioning, because I find this fascinating, and hopefully you do too. If not, let me know, because there will probably be a lot of this kind of talk until I finish developing all the games. There are many, many fewer one-ball horse race games than there are bingos, so I don't anticipate that there will be a whole lot of this talk going forward, because most of them, frankly, are not quite this complex. Most of them only have maybe a single mixer, maybe a couple mixers, and a reflex. But most of them don't even have that. Most of them, in fact, don't have guaranteed advancing odds. This is one of the innovations that Don Hooker brought to Bally when he started working there. Prior to his arrival, and this particular innovation, if you put in a second coin, you weren't guaranteed to get higher odds than what you had already had displayed on the back glass. In fact, they might go back to the very minimal odds. So it was always a gamble if you put in a second coin, whether or not you were actually going to come out ahead. Now, you might have other advantages that help you out, but unfortunately, you could lose some feature or odds that you had already earned. This is not the case with Turf King, thankfully. It uses the guaranteed advancing odds, which of course Don Hooker brought over to the bingos when he started developing those. Single ball game, it's one ball, just as it sounds like it should be. And that one ball is crucial. So the most vital thing that you do is you build up the game with coins, and then you just have the one shot to get it. So you have to make sure that it counts. When you plunge that ball, your plunge, of course, is absolutely critical, but also steering the ball, which is quite a bit harder in the one-ball horse race games than it is on the bingos, because it's much harder to nudge the game than it is with the bingo. So couple that with the fact that the playfield is quite a bit wider, and it just makes nudging quite the challenge. You are not having quite the effect that you have on the ball normally with these one-ball games, because the cabinets are floor length. Just harder to move it. So let's talk about portioning here. I have finished all of the portioning for the game, and now I'm going through and adding simple features, scoring things like the carryover features and labeling the various relays and so forth. Relatively simple stuff, but the portioning I did first. Now, on the one balls, this is before Bally started documenting things very well, basically giving you the wiring diagram for each of the discs which have rotational logic, things like the spotting disc or the search disc. There is no search disc in any of the one balls that I've seen because there's nothing to search for. You only have one ball. You're not trying to make 3 or more. You're trying to make a single switch win. So it's a lot more straightforward there. However, there can be 1 or more spotting discs, and then couple that with, in Turf King, 4 mixers and the reflex, and you wind up with quite a complicated set of portioning. Turf King also has what is essentially pick-a-play. So if you're familiar with kind of the bingos from the middle of their production period, you had multiple buttons that would control achieving various things. Now, the red button always earns you any advantage, but you also, on the bingos, had the blue button, which would only play for odds, or the green button, which would only play for features. And in some cases, you had a white button, which would only play for certain special games or other novelties, basically, that were tied to a particular game. On Turf King, you have 5 buttons. The first being Play All, which functions just like the red button on the bingos. It plays for all advantages at the same time. You have a Star button, which plays for advances and odds only. You have a Clover button, which plays for doubled awards in certain sections of the playfield. You have a Horseshoe button, which changes your selection. So these are how you know which number you have to make with that one ball. And it's critical that you get something good. But it can have a disadvantage as well as several advantages. So we'll go over that here in just a second. And the final button is a flag, and that's used to play for the feature. The feature is a special pocket down at the bottom center of the playfield. It's essentially in the spot where the ball return is on the bingos, but in this case it's a scoring pocket. And the feature pocket will award you either 160 replays or 300 replays, and it's adjustable by the operator. Frankly, it is a 1 in a million shot, and the portioning is very tough on it. It's not as tough as I thought it was after reading through the documentation, but it's still very tough. I had thought that there was a secondary reflex that controlled the portioning for just that feature. That's not the case, and in fact the feature portioning doesn't even go through the reflex at all. It's the only feature on the game which does not portion through the reflex, except for the jockey cap feature, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I was a little surprised at this, and this is coming from somebody who has worked on one of these before. Actually, my daughter did. She fixed up the game, but it's still surprising to me how much I have to learn about the portioning of these games, because that's not something that I typically mess with unless something is just absolutely not working. So looking at how the portioning functions on the feature was quite illuminating. But beyond that, most everything runs through the reflex, but the pick-a-play buttons have a much more direct effect on how you are awarded whatever benefit you're trying to play for than they do on the bingos. So the bingos typically will connect an extra finger on the spotting disc and allow you to potentially get a better outcome. Doesn't quite work that way, but it's pretty close to what I'm describing there. And on the horse race games, the way that it works is these pick-a-play buttons will actually bypass huge sections of the portioning. It's really quite astounding, actually. For example, if you're playing for selections, you jump past about, I would say, 60% of the portioning. Playing for odds, if you're using the star button, again, you're jumping past this huge chunk of portioning. It's crazy. But with that said, it is certainly still very difficult to earn whatever features or odds advances as a player, from a player's perspective. Because each nickel, which in 1950, which is when this game came out, nickel was big money. So it's kind of interesting to see the thought behind how you would get these awards. And the pick-a-play has a much more integral function than I thought. Now, as a player, I typically use them, but that's because I typically use them on the bingos. As a casual player, I would probably just hit play all the time and be done with it. But the way that it works is not it's not advantageous to do so. Let me just put it that way. So let's talk about some of the specific features and some of the interesting portioning things there too. One of the features is called the jockey cap feature, and this is an alternating feature, meaning once the feature is awarded for each coin that's input after it has been awarded, it will alternate between left and right side, and directly above and to the left and right of the feature hole that I talked about, there are these jockey cap holes. One is yellow and one is red. Very similar to the rollovers on the bingos, if you think about it. One is yellow, one is red, one is on one side, one's on the other. They're typically only enabled one at a time. And on some of the games, for example, Miss America 1957, they're alternating just like on this. But the jockey caps have a very cool function. If they're lit and you happen to land in it, it functions not as an additional scoring pocket per se, but it enables a carryover feature to the next game. So if you land in the lit jockey cap, it will advance what's called the wild stepper all the way to the end, which will trip a relay, which will enable all 7 selections on your next game. This is really cool. Of course, that's a mode where you can't lose, but the portioning tightens up considerably. Some of the paths are just not available when that relay is tripped. So particularly for odds, you have to be very cautious if you're pumping in money trying to bump up your odds. It can still happen, just not very easily. So that feature is kind of neat, and it also, for whatever reason, doesn't run through the reflex. It does run through one of 2 spotting discs and one of the mixers, but it's odd to me that the reflex isn't in the circuit at all. Just knowing what I know about how the features are awarded typically in bingos, I would think the reflex would always be in there. But I guess there are certain gimmies that Don Hooker wanted to provide the player where you would be not guaranteed something, because again, there is portioning involved, but it's much easier if it bypasses this thing that is auto portioning the entire game. I just find the design fascinating. It's really interesting to me to think about how much Don Hooker and the other folks at Bally really thought about what they were doing, as far as how the player would react, and how much money, of course, these games would take in. So, very cool. So the wild stepper I mentioned shows the 4 different sections of the playfield, and there's a step for each letter in each of the sections. So it's purse, show, place, and win. Once it hits the top, it trips that fan relay, and it doesn't matter if that happens through coin play or through the jockey feature. There is also a way for it to step multiple times, but only to specific sections in the stepper. Again, this is a level of detail that I've never really had to investigate in this thing. It's always just worked. Interestingly, a thing that I learned from people who played these games long ago is that they would put in money once they saw that stepper starting to move. And the reason being, it would arrest the stepper, stop it from moving, because they knew that the portioning would tighten up once the stepper hit certain phases. So, for example, once it finishes stepping through purse and hits the E, a portion of the portioning disappears for features. Once it hits the W in show, it tightens up again, and more of the portioning goes away. I just think this is really interesting. Hopefully you do too. It's surprising to me, the amount of detail that's involved in this. Of course, this is one of the later games, so when I turn around to do some of the earlier games, of course, there won't be any portioning whatsoever. It's just going to be a very simple, the spotting disc landed on this particular spot, and so number 4 is your selection, and your odds are at first position or whatever. A lot easier. The challenge in these games is the documentation. So, wonderfully, beautifully, on Turf King, they had put the mixer positions on most of the portioning and the spotting disc positions as well, but not all of them. So there are 2 different spotting discs, and spotting disc 1 is completely undocumented. Spotting disc 2 has rivet numbers, but they're not. They're blueprint numbers. They're not rivet numbers. So you're supposed to match that with the blueprint, and then you'll be able to know what positions do what. Unfortunately, it's not direct. So it might say number 2, for example, but that could be 3, 6, 9, 15, 23, and it would be hard to know. Then is there more than one wiper that is hitting that? And if so, are they offset 25? Are they offset 15? Are they offset 12? Where exactly are the wipers mounted? So this is all stuff that I'm going to have to document. Right now I've got some dummy code in place, which approximates what it should be. And thankfully I have this game, but for many of the other games, I won't have access to the game. So I'm going to have to make some approximations and be willing to tweak it after the fact. That's what I've had to do on the multi-bingo as well. There's much more and much better documentation for that, so I haven't had to do that as much, but I have had to do it a little bit. On this, I have to be more flexible, so I need to be willing to accept the fact that it's not going to be absolutely perfect. And that goes for animations as well. So the animations are completely undocumented. So on Turf King, again, I can actually document them. I'm looking forward to getting that done, but I won't be able to do that on almost any other game. I also have a Victory Derby, but that's it as far as one balls go. So I need to, be cognizant of the fact that it's not going to be perfect, but it will be playable. All the features will exist, and I will be able to go in and tweak the portioning and so forth as needed once documentation comes to light. And I have spoken to a couple of one-ball collectors, and I'm hoping that they'll be able to help me a little bit with some of the things that I need as far as documentation, or at least videos of the games being played, so that I can map the coin flash specifically. So that's multi-races. It's coming along. I'm pretty excited that I almost have a finished game. Now, finished in quotes, because I haven't done any of the graphics yet, but the logic portion. And the logic portion for this, as I mentioned, is one of the most complicated ones. In fact, Sunshine Park is the last game that they made, and it's 2 after Turf King. And that one is more complex in different ways. But Turf King is very complex on its own, and I'm pleased that it's pretty much done. So, going to keep plugging away on that. And as far as Robo-Frenzy goes, I don't believe last time I recorded an episode I was finished with the player steppers. So let's talk about that for a moment, because this has also been an interesting learning experience. I'm trying to repurpose parts as much as possible, meaning I don't want to have to create my own wiper discs or things of that nature. Not that it's impossible to do, because it's certainly possible to do. They're, after all, just a bunch of brass rivets on a disc, and there has to be some kind of wiping action that happens over them. But mainly because the discs that were mass-produced are very rugged, and nothing that I make would be as rugged. So for the player unit, which handles the position of the player, there are 8 different distinct positions going down the hill and coming back. And for each of those positions, not only the player has to illuminate, but also potentially a gear when they're in those positions. So handling the logic to just handle lighting those has been interesting. You have rotational logic coupled with ascending and descending values, and I tried to make it smooth. So as you rotate a wheel, there's going to be a hand wheel that's the player control for each player. As you rotate the wheel, your character is going to move down the hill, and if you keep spinning in the same direction, it'll move back up the hill and then back down the hill. Now, there's only certain positions which are truly valuable. So the very top allows you to drop a gear off, and the very bottom allows you to pick up a gear. In between, it's just the space, heading up or heading down. So with that in mind, I've wired it so that those very important positions are not super frequent. So if you look at the pattern that I've written down, it'll show that it starts kind of in the middle, and it goes back up to the top, and then back down to the bottom, and back up to the top, and then to the middle again. So it's not exactly what you'd think. I have only 25 positions to work with, because the other 25 have to carry the voltage for the thing that I'm doing, be it driving coils or lamps. So it's a 50 position disc that I'm using, and it's a Williams match unit. Now, why did I pick a match unit? Well, in Williams games, the match units were actually used for an awful lot of logic within the game. They had to take a tremendous amount of abuse, and they are very robust. So I won't be driving it with the coil. I'll be driving it with the hand wheel, which will turn a reduction gear, which will spin that at a particular rate of speed, which is not super fast. So as a player, you won't be able to just whip the wheel and then have it fly up and down the hill. You'll have to turn it very deliberately, and all the while, this octopus is chasing you. So another thing that I did is wired up 4 additional octopus relays. In the beginning, and this is kind of a cost reduction design thing that I realized wouldn't work very well, but the octopus changes its path based on your position on the wheel. So it does this through the use of these octopus relays, but I realized if the octopus is attacking and moving in certain directions on player 1, it needs to be able to move in different directions on player 2, and that's because player 2 will be in different positions than player 1. Now, initially, I was just going to set it so that player 1 controlled the whole thing, but that's kind of lame. So instead, what I'm going to do is each player will control their own side with their position, and the octopus will be much more aggressive to both sides because of this. The other thing is that you will need to be paying pretty careful attention to the pattern, and the pattern on each side is slightly different. It's not completely different, but it's slightly different. Now, the reason for this is that lighting the lamps for the octopus tentacles was actually extremely difficult. It was quite a logic puzzle. I have 2 separate trip banks, which are those ones I was waiting on for a long time, and picked up at the York show. And of course, that was perfectly great timing because I'd been working on the multi for so long. I needed to finish that up before I started on this in earnest. But anyway, with those trip banks, I realized I was going to need like 7 or 8 switches per trip, which is just insane. I mean, that's too many switches. Now you can double gang some of these things and add additional actuators, but it starts to get really unwieldy. And then you think about all the switching action that's involved there, and it's really quite cumbersome. So I had a friend over, friend Joe, and he was willing to listen to me blab about this thing for a little while. He wanted to see the progress on it, and I said, that's totally fine, but it doesn't play yet. And yeah, he just wanted to see what was up. So ended up talking with him about this problem that I had, and he suggested, hey, why don't you just use diodes? And honestly, it had never occurred to me. I thought that was a fantastic suggestion. So the diodes go in between each segment, and that allows me to handle the pattern independently for each trip relay. So trip relay 1 falls down, and one of the tentacles is going to be at max extension. The other 3 will be in various states. And trip number 2 goes down, and one of the switches on it will disable the output from trip number 1 and then enable its own output. I thought this was pretty clever, and it certainly saved me a heck of a lot of time with wiring. So I've got diodes all over the place in there, and honestly, I don't feel too bad about that. Now, he made a joke like, there wouldn't be diodes available for games that would have been made in this time period, but I've worked on bingos from the 50s that have diodes. It was not unheard of. It's just, it was a very expensive component back then. But we're talking the 1970s, that's essentially where some of the relay parts are from. So, and the cab design is certainly from the 70s. So it seems to me that it fits right in. And I feel that way because it has to. So that's Robo-Frenzy. I need to go over to my friend Joe's again here with the player units, because the wipers are not 25 rivets apart. They're 20 rivets apart, or 10 rivets apart, because it's a match unit. Every 10 points, it rolls over to the next number. So I need to drill a hole in the wiper disc, and I need to move over one of the wipers, or 2 of the wipers actually. This is going to be very challenging because you essentially only get 1, maybe 2 shots at this thing, and then you're out of luck, if you didn't get it. So I'm going to see what I can do. Of course, measure 65 times, cut once. That's the old saying, I think. So let's move on to today's featured game. It's 1950s Williams Dreamy. And Dreamy is a impulse flipper game. There's 2 flippers. Both are controlled with either button. So when you hit the button, the flippers will flap up and then flap back down. The playfield layout is really quite interesting. This is something that I've never had the opportunity to play, but I would love to, looking at the layout. Up at the top center, there's a kick-out hole that's worth 50,000 points, or 500,000 points if it's lit. There's also a passive bumper, which is worth 100,000 points when it's lit, and I assume 10,000 points when it's not lit. There are 3 lanes at the top left. each worth 50,000 points, until you knock out all 3 of them, at which point they become worth 500,000 points. Pretty sweet deal. Underneath these lanes on the left and right side, you have 2 bumpers, pop bumpers, which can fling the ball back and forth. And there is a single point rollover. Now, points are different from score. If you're a long-term listener, you're aware of this with various Gottlieb games that I've talked about, but Williams experimented with this as well. Points are essentially a major sequence within the game. So there's a minor sequence and a major sequence in points games. It is completely separate from score, and you can have multiple points. So in this game, up to 40. Your score, however, can be in the millions and millions for this game. So it is neat to have multiple goals that you can work towards. Continuing down the playfield on the left and right side, you have 2 lanes. The outermost one is worth 5 points, and if you've completed the sequence 1 through 5, if you'll recall, there's the numbers 1 through 3 at the top left. If you complete 1 through 5, that 5-point lane becomes a special. And directly to the right or left, depending on the side of the playfield, there's a rollover that's worth 500,000 points, and it will spot the number 4 or the number 5. 4 on the left, 5 on the right, and that completes your sequence. In the very middle of the playfield, there's another kick-out hole that's worth 50,000 or 500,000. And continuing down in the center, there is a 1-point rollover. Now, the beauty of this rollover, and I have played a different game that used this particular setup, you'd be able, as a player, to lob the ball back and forth between the rubbers on the left and right side and the flippers, and keep nailing that 1-point rollover. And once you hit a certain threshold, and that's going to be operator adjustable, you're going to win 1 or more replays. So it's in your best interest to rack that up as much as possible. Down between the flippers, there is also a kickout, and that is worth 50,000 or 500,000. There are slings down at the bottom left and right, which are below the triangular plastics that flank that 1-point rollover. So they're in kind of a unusual spot geometrically, because you have to be at a certain point on them in order to get past the flipper so that you can get back up and hit that 1 point. So it's in your best interest to do some pretty serious nudging to get the ball to go where it needs to go. But once it hits that sling, it can rocket back up and hit that 1 point, and you're in good shape. If it hits that bottom kick out, though, it can kick right down into the trough. So this is an interesting game. It's one of Williams's games, and Williams had some pretty interesting features. One of the features that, as far as I know, they came up with first was any ball leaving the playfield would reset the tilt. So if you managed to tilt out on ball 1, for example, your game wasn't over. You could plunge ball 2 and it would continue to score as long as ball 1 had left the playfield. Any ball that's stuck in the kickout hole, of course, when you tilt out, the score motor continues to run. It doesn't score, but it'll kick the ball out and shoot it back down the playfield. So you're never in a situation where a ball is stuck and you're unable to continue play, or you shouldn't be, rather. So I think that feature is really cool and certainly ahead of its time. Games typically didn't do that into the 1960s or so, and we're talking 1950 here. So very impressive. Let's talk about the sequence of this game. So I mentioned 1 through 5, and it's a fairly simple sequence, only 5 numbers. But what's kind of cool about it is Dreamy is actually a music theme, and each of the numbers represents a song or an album that was popular in 1949. So looking at the titles, we have Some Enchanted Evening is number 1, Room Full of Roses, number 2, My Bolero, number 3, Here Comes Heaven Again, number 4, and I Know, I Know, I Know at number 5. I find that very cool. Of course, pop culture references, not new to pinball, but what is interesting about it is that it used the actual titles of these famous songs. So obviously trying to cash in on what was in the zeitgeist at the time. I think that's pretty unique and cool. What's also interesting, very colorful back glass, multiple colors and arrayed in just this cool circular rainbow type situation radiating out from the central character, who is dreaming, I suppose, of all these different songs, while pianos float in the upper left and bottom right. But the score is entirely backlit. The points are illuminated on the playfield, kind of like a bonus counter, but the score is all backlit animation on the back glass. That's a bit unusual. Most games are very kind of loud and proud about the numbers that are shown. You want to have bragging rights, I suppose, so, why not show that 100,000 being lit or that million points? You fought for it, you earned it. But that's not so with this game. So let's talk about the playfield artwork. It is primarily blue and red. The plastics are yellow, and the red is arrayed in a triangular shape around the 1-point rollovers, and in the center there is that one kick out. The point counter is shaped in a triangle shape. I find the design of this very attractive, mostly coupled with the plastics. So the artwork is not extremely exciting in and of itself, although I do like the design that they have for that triangular section in the middle, from an artwork perspective. From a gameplay perspective even more, but that's a different subject. But the plastics are very cool. There's a different woman's head on each plastic, and she's essentially telling you or watching the gameplay and saying, this is worth 500,000 points or it's worth 50,000 points, that kind of thing. Now, around the bumpers, the pop bumpers, there is a sunburst, coming out, and very appealing looking, very cool. And as with many of the Williams games that had this tilt reset when the ball leaves the playfield, there's essentially a one-way gate down at the bottom and a big card that says tilt reset to let you know what it does. I thought that was very clever as well. I've always liked that feature, and I hope to play more games with that feature in the future. The cabinet artwork is interesting. It's one of those ones where, this must not have had any particular theme from the cabinet maker, but it's primarily green, the green base coat, with yellow arrows that are pointing either up through the head or towards the front of the machine. And they pass through what looks like a circle in the center. There's a couple of stripes, one yellow, one red, and one black. And that's it for the artwork. I think it's, just as muted as it needs to be. It doesn't necessarily need to stand out, but it's kind of interesting that it's almost non-musical. You could make the argument that there's a bit of a record theme by looking at that, but you have to make a pretty big jump there. At any rate, that's Williams Dreamy, and I look forward to playing it one day. that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for listening. And also to my listeners who celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas to you. And Happy New Year to everybody. And I will be talking with you again in 2 weeks. So thanks very much for listening. My name again is Nick Baldridge. You can reach me at foramusementonlypodcast@gmail.com, or you can call me on the Bingos line. That's 724-BINGOS1, 724-246-4671. You can listen to me on iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, Google Play Music, on Stitcher, Spotify. You can follow me on Twitter at Bingo Podcast, or on Instagram, also at Bingo Podcast. You can follow me on my Facebook page, which is the For Amusement Only EM and Bingo Pinball Podcast, or on my website, which is foramusementonly.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.